Welcome to Incorruptible Mass. Our mission here is to help us all transform state politics because we know that we could have a state that truly represents the needs of the vast majority of the residents who live here. And today we will be talking about the importance for all legislators, city and state here in Massachusetts, to pass laws that are not currently legal. And you might think, what? That sounds crazy. But, we will start with sort of the easy ones in terms of voting, doing home rule petitions for around things that the state has not allowed enabling legislation for yet. We'll also talk about an example from my experience in Berkeley, California. We'll talk about how Republicans and Democrats view this differently. We'll talk about abortion care. We'll talk about fossil fuel infrastructure. So we've got a lot of things, and education as well, diversity. So we got a lot of stuff to talk about. But before we do, I'm going to have my two illustrious co-hosts introduce themselves. I will start with Jonathan.
So it didn't unmute properly. Jonathan Cohn, he, him, his. I've been active with the progressive issue and electoral campaigns here in Massachusetts for around a decade now, and joining from Boston in the South End.
And Jordan.
Jordan Berg Powers, he, him, and I am joining from the road for my birthday week.
Woo! Happy birthday, Jordan. If I may, I'm going to make a plug that you can give a few bucks. Jordan, you tell me if you're terribly offended.
Please do. For my birthday, that's an amazing idea. I'll also post it online. Great idea.
Fantastic. So give a few bucks to the podcast for Jordan's birthday. And I'm going to start this one off with a little story of the sort of first moment that my brain exploded on hearing this idea, which is I was on a commission in Berkeley, the Open Government Commission. And in Berkeley, I had helped to do all the canvassing work for passing a public financing of elections law, which gave 6-to-1 funding to anybody who, signed up for this law, for this new legislation, and agreed not to take more than $50 from any single person. And we were implementing that law, and we had some possibilities for implementing the law that we knew had been struck down by the Arizona Supreme Court by the Arizona Supreme Court, because it didn't agree with the Supreme Court's definition that corporations are people. So it had to do with allowing corporations or not allowing corporations to put money into campaigns. We were debating it, and people were like, oh, we can't pass that because it might get struck down. And one of the guys on there said something I will never forget. He said, "It is not our job to uphold the wrong decisions of a right-wing Supreme Court. It is, in fact, our job to pass laws that put pressure on the Supreme Court to change their decision. And if every city in the country would just continue to pass laws that push those boundaries, then we would have a better country." And it was just this wonderful moment where I was like, what? Oh my God, that's amazing. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you guys if you have any general ideas about this concept of passing laws that are not legal, which sounds a little crazy.
I want to defer to Jordan, who has a lot of opinions on this. First.
All right, yeah. I guess I'll say, I just think what happens a lot of the times is that conservatives have really bad ideas, and then they also have really bad logic. And when they pass their bad ideas, we fill in their bad logic with good logic. We make it logical. And so then we end up facilitating the sort of oppression that we ourselves are opposing, because we're trying to make it make sense. We're trying to make it rational. And I'm not saying that we have to go out of our way to flagrantly be like them and just don't believe in law, but we certainly don't need to go out of our way to enforce laws in a way that they think they intend, but their logic models haven't totally played out. So they often say things that are just totally illogical. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but one of my favorites is that Clarence Thomas said that the Freedmen's Bureau was race neutral. Like, that's obviously a ridiculous supposition. But if you believe that to be true, then you could just pass legislation that says that descendants of the Freedmen's Bureau, I can't imagine who that might be, get certain things, right? But we instead take their logic we take what they said to their full conclusion, and we therefore say, well, then we can't understand that Black people exist and therefore might have certain things happen. And so we do the work of enforcing their bad ideas rather than taking the logic that underpins their ideas and throwing them out and like, you know, working around them. And we could pass laws on their logic models. We could pass laws that just basically throw in the face the sort of silliness of their ideas, but we don't. We end up trying to enforce their bad ideas and what they meant to say. You know, it's sort of like the way the media makes Trump sound cogent by snipping the 15 seconds where he strings together a cogent sentence, and then you get the impression that he does that, or George W. Bush, when like if you ever listen to 5 minutes of it, you realize it's nonsense.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in because I forgot to introduce myself. Anna Callahan, she, her, you know, coming at you from Medford, and mentioned that as a city councilor in Medford, as a legislator, I also think not just about the logic and the sort of these weird structures of logic that they have, but about values, that it is my job to pass laws that uphold our values. And if those values are not the values of the Supreme Court, tough. Tough. It's my job to still pass laws that are based on our values. Jonathan, thoughts?
Yeah, the thing that this reminds me of is I feel like over the years that Republicans have been very good at, like, I think especially when it comes to, let's say, issues around abortion rights, where their strategy was to pass things that clearly flouted Roe versus Wade, and they kept doing it over the years, noting that eventually they can whittle away at a law, and then at some point, the Supreme Court will use their case to just eliminate the law entirely. And it's like always by then used for evil ends, but like it was a smart strategy just used for totally evil purposes, and they do it quite often of the strategy of, rather than approaching things, as I feel like often Democrats approach legislation by thinking of what are all of the things that we can't do. And you basically enter that as your beginning things of like, because either if you toss things out because you don't think that the public is fully supportive, or the donors aren't supportive, or whoever you care about in that exact moment because of that issue, you don't think are supportive, you toss those aside. And then you often also use, but what if this gets ruled out in court, without even trying? Because the best way to assume, like, you don't need to do a court's work for it by simply not passing something. See what gets, like, if somebody wants to challenge it, see what gets held up. Rather than kind of preconceiving on that entirely, because it's also, not only can you actually get better chances of getting ambitious policy by doing this, you might be able to change the laws as a result as well. And I just feel like it's one of many examples where we've seen kind of in the conservative political ecosystem a very long-term strategy in that regard of both using it to kind of to weaken more progressive legal infrastructures, as well as to like ultimately change them. Where so often on the liberal side of things that it's just kind of assumed that you just don't try.
And I'm glad you mentioned abortion care, because, you know, they left it up to the states, but what if Massachusetts, you know, publicly announced that, like, hey, now anyone from any state can get their abortion care from us, like just telemedicine, make it all, you know, legal. Like that would put pressure on the Dobbs decision.
Exactly. It's good to test the limits of what, kind of important to test the limits of what you can do, rather than impose the limits on yourself that nobody has created for you.
Exactly. Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, I would say I feel like that's kind of one thing that we often like criticize, because you also see that just, I feel like in general, here in kind of in state policy making, of assuming constraints that they may exist, but you don't need to be the one imposing them on yourself.
Exactly.
Don't do other people's jobs for them.
Exactly. Jordan, do you want to jump in? I know you were talking about integration across districts. And do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about education?
Yeah, well, I guess I also want to talk a little bit about what Jonathan said, which is like this is going to be important as rising fascism across the world continues. One of the things that fascist governments want is for people to do the work for them, right? Because they can't be everywhere, and it's really important that we don't agree. And if we don't agree, that we act accordingly, and if our legislators have power to also act accordingly. So one of the things that happened after the first, so one of the things that happened after Brown versus Board of Education is that we still had really segregated schools. So the Supreme Court ruled, well, we can force sort of integration. We can force integration inside of school districts. And then the Supreme Court soon, a few years after, it got turned over. Rehnquist gets on the court, and the Supreme Court then rules that actually you can't force integration of schools across school districts. And for that reason, we get just sort of, there was already white flight, but now you're just seeing extreme white flight and sort of, all of many attempts to just sort of like reinforce sort of racial segregation, especially in the North, around education. And so one of the things that we could do to sort of push the limits is have cross-county integration. That would be a way where we know from integration is that integration had the best outcomes for everyone. That one of the mistakes that white parents have is there's this assumption that if Black and brown students, at least too many of us, go to a school, that is therefore a bad school. But actually what we know is that at the height of integration, outcomes for students were at their highest across every income, across every racial background that we had back then that we were testing. And so that helps all students. And so if we allowed integration across counties, we know it would impact every student positively. And it's a clear flouting of their laws. But the Supreme Court also clearly has these ideas now that like states can do whatever they want. So like this would be a really good time to flout that law and to really push an outcome that's more on our values as Massachusetts of ensuring that there is equal opportunity through education, no matter your zip code.
I love it. That's such a fantastic idea. I wanted to bring up another one, a climate one, which is that in Brookline a few years ago, they passed a law that was no new fossil fuel infrastructure, basically, and would not allow new developments, for example, to have gas stoves. And they passed the law, and then it went to the state, and the state, the state basically said, you are not allowed to do this. This is not legal according to the state laws in Massachusetts. But what's important is that, and this wasn't like enabling legislation. Oh, we should talk about enabling legislation in a minute. This was just this was a law that they thought they could pass. So what's important to know is that now there is some movement at the state level to change those underlying laws that made that impossible for cities and towns to do. And so that's exactly the point. It was when you pass something that is the right thing according to our values, and you say, look, we should just pass it, and then we'll see what happens at the state. The more cities that pass something like that, the more likely it is that the state is going to change those underlying laws and make it possible for us to do the things that we need to do for climate change and other things. Yeah. I
also think that like the case with Brooklyn, it also just reminds me of one of the values of Brooklyn doing that, even if there was a chance of it being challenged, being struck down, is you raise the profile of the limitations of the current laws. Like you'll get media coverage and create a certain sense of voter outrage that something that they probably thought it was already legal is in fact not, which then helps, as you know, create pressure for the legislature to take action.
Absolutely. This is a really interesting place to bring up the sort of enabling legislation in Massachusetts, because I feel like on the one hand, enable these like home rule petitions, things like, for example, a transfer fee, right? Or rent control or whatever, that they're going to the state. I mean, rent control is different, but there's a bunch that are like tenant opportunity to purchase, transfer fee, and those that are going to the state as a request, home rule petition, saying, can we please have this in our city? And theoretically, the state could say yes, although the state is not saying yes. The state is instead working on enabling legislation, which would allow any city or town to pass those laws. I feel like on the one hand, it's a good example of ways that cities can pass things that are not legal, right? It's just a normal home rule petition. It's part of normal stuff that you do as a legislator. On the other hand, it's incredibly frustrating because on those particular instances, the home rule petitions never go through, right? It's not like, hey, we want to hire a dog catcher for $30,000. The state passes 150 of those a year, right? That the city of, Woburn or whoever wants to do X, Y, Z, but they don't pass the ones that are for these kinds of housing policies and other policies that they supposedly are working on enabling legislation for. Jonathan?
No, I think that that's a good point, and it just speaks to what we were talking about before about the need to change laws. Like, it is always wild to me. We had a whole prior discussion about home rule in Massachusetts about how restrictive it is, and that the way in which it often mirrors what we see in a number of red states where like a Republican legislature tries to ban like a liberal capital city from passing its own laws.
Yep. Any other examples that we have that we want to bring up for today?
Yeah, I guess I just think there's a lot. Oh no, you go, Jonathan.
Yeah. The one thing when it comes to, let's say, like preemptively conceding rather than trying things that are not necessarily like explicitly prohibited, but like viewed as possibly prohibited by different things, it reminds me of the issues around like single payer health insurance, where there are various like federal waivers that a state would need to be able to get in order to do that. And so rather than simply being like that, states like to use the possible roadblocks as a reason not to do something rather than there are roadblocks to any policy that you want to create. So how do you best navigate them?
Yeah. Jordan?
We're on the same page. I was thinking the exact same thing, that like, California, New York, Massachusetts could just pass single payer and just do it just create a cross-state network and just give the middle finger to the Supreme Court and see what happens. Like, and there's no reason, especially if it's one of the things too where legislators, it's sort of funny. Like, for a long time, Republicans, the thing is said, like, what will Republicans do if the Supreme Court actually overturns Roe? And I think like one of the things that would be great about doing some of these things is like legislators are actually scared about their outcomes, and so they use the fact that they might get struck down as a reason. But if they're going to get struck down, you might as well just pass it. Like, there's actually then no worry for you about it. And so I think also just getting our legislators to rethink about their roles, that sometimes like that they're so immediately worried about what could happen, that they end up not doing anything, or they use them excuses as not doing anything. And like, do I think that if we all pass single payer, that it would just happen? No, I think insurance companies and other people would start to freak out. But that would be the next logical ratchet up for the outcome that we want, because it's just unlikely we're going to go from zero to a federal single payer. And we need states to be thinking really creatively about it. Similarly with what you mentioned, Anna, about abortion care, like, why aren't we just saying telehealth for everybody on abortion and just force the issue, right? Like, just force the issue. And, do what Republican states do. When they strike it down, change a word and just pass it again, over and over again.
Yeah, I totally agree. I hope that people found this interesting to talk about the idea that legislators should be passing things that are illegal, that it's part of our job to pass our values, right? And not like fit into the other side's framing and the other side's logic and the other side's values, really, which is what it ends up happening. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jordan. Thanks for joining us on your birthday week and from the road. And Jonathan, as always, love having you guys all the time. And we look forward to talking with everyone again next week. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching us on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. And it would be amazing if you would also subscribe to us on your favorite podcast player. Just look for Incorruptible Massachusetts wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much.